During lockdown, during the pandemic, I got the bright idea that I was going to learn how to make bread. My family was not one. We went out and bought Wonder Bread from the store. That's how we got bread. And so I was determined that it was not going to be by way of a bread machine, that I was going to do it from scratch. Well, the worst part of it was trying to be patient enough while the stuff sat there. Now, I didn't know, and maybe that's why it took longer, I didn't know I was supposed to keep the yeast in the refrigerator. Is that, I don't know. It's in the pantry where it's about 90,000 degrees. No, I'm just kidding, it's not. But I didn't know that. So anyway, one of the things, first of all, to note about this is that it's obvious that this is a collection of parables. In understanding how the Gospels come to be, that by way of eyewitnesses who actually saw Jesus, walked with Jesus, and followed him, that they would catch snippets of things that he said, and they would remember them. After a while, they had no clue where he said it, or why he said it, what the circumstance was. But in any event, when it comes a time to gather all of these stories together and experiences together, that the eyewitnesses, as they share them perhaps with the gospel writer, maybe the gospel writer says, well, when did he say this? Or why did he say this? And they just shrug their shoulders. And the gospel writer, therefore, has a collection, as we see today, of sayings, parables of Jesus. And so he just says, well, we'll just lump them all together. Not that they originally had any connection to each other or not, which does make it very difficult then to provide some type of reflection or interpretation of them. Another point, it's clear that when it comes to the gospel writer is not an eyewitness to Jesus, is a secondary source, if you will. And it's important to remember that the audience of Jesus is very different from the audience of the gospel writer, meaning we're already maybe 20, 30 years after the time of Jesus. And so the audience to whom the gospel writer is putting these stories, for whom the gospel writer is putting these stories together, is very different. Now we know that Matthew's gospel is written for a more Jewish community that perhaps is struggling to integrate Gentiles and non-believers and a whole bunch of other folks. So there is an edge to how the gospel writer puts all these stories together. And the edge is that the freedom of any author or writer, the freedom is that you cannot change what you receive, meaning he can't change, the gospel writer can't change what he gets from the eyewitnesses, but he's free to add to it. Because his audience, that's how you keep the audience engaged. If I were to tell you a story of something that happened 40 years ago, you'd go, so what? But if I add to that story from 40 years ago something of interest for today, then you're going to go, oh, well, okay, now I see how this works for us in the contemporary community. I point that out because the last parable is probably not at all from Jesus, meaning the fish that get drug into the shore. The image might take you back to Jesus. But let's face it, that the contrast between the words of Jesus and the understanding of those words in Matthew's community is very different. And I say that with all politeness to Matthew as a gospel writer, because we just have to be honest that last part of the gospel today is far from the vision of the reign of God. Meaning that you can see fishermen on the shore going, that's a carp. Oh, well, that's a catfish. Oh, the separating of good and bad would not have been at all in the teachings of Jesus. It is in the teachings of Matthew and his community of disciples. And therefore, we have to be careful of the judgment-sounding language in that part of the parable to say it is not from Jesus. It is from the gospel writer. But, you see, over time as Christians, we understand that once it gets put in there, we can't take it out either. Meaning we're not going to go like Thomas Jefferson. You know how Thomas Jefferson, the great Enlightenment scholar, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that because he was such an enlightened figure, that he goes through the Gospels and cuts out all the miracles of Jesus from the text, because as a good scientific believer, he says none of those miracles could happen because it just takes a suspension of intelligence to see them. So you can actually see his Bible in the Library of Congress today with great big sections of it cut out. We don't need to do that, but we have to have some degree of critical thinking applied to the text to know that when we hear that kind of language, that it's not Jesus speaking. It is Matthew speaking. And for our purposes, what we're going to be interested in is what Jesus had to say. Therefore, I rely upon, and the only reason why I'm doing this again today, because I did it last week, is because our book study group used Amy Jill Levine's book on parables. And it would be far remiss from me to play ignorant on these parables when we just studied it and read her text on 4 of these parables. So having said that, a couple of things to note. We hear a parable about the sowing of a seed. We hear a parable about a woman baking bread. We hear a parable about a fortune seeker, or called a merchant. And we are asked to consider what's going on with these events. So the sower sows a seed, and what we're told is that it's a mustard seed. Now, I had long thought all kinds of things about this, and at least 6 months ago, I would have preached this very differently. But with the wisdom of Amy Jill Levine, I've now come to my senses and see that some of my preaching and teaching was really incorrect, according to her view of the parables. And so a thing to note about this is that each of these kind of had good and bad aspects to them. So it depends upon how you're going to read them as to whether you're going to fall out on the bad or on the good. Now just consider that. So this mustard plant, for a long time I've called it a weed. Well, actually, mustard plant in the ancient world was a medicinal plant. Sort of like those goofy dandelions that I talked about last week. If you put a little vinegar and oil on it, it might taste good. Far be it from me to try it, but and anyway, see how that goes. But something to consider about it. Again, we know this comes from the time of Jesus because it just makes sense that if you live in a rural area of the world, that you're going to see this happen, right? That probably the mustard seed, unlike my cantaloupe plant and my zucchini plant, automatically fertilizes itself. And so therefore, when the seeds fall, they're fertilized, and plants pop up. And sometimes you just see them everywhere, right? And if they're medicinal plants, you're going to go, oh, wow, look how wonderful this is. But something to consider, and it's not the smallest seed here, but it's a small enough seed that you have to wonder, how does it get this way? From this tiny seed to a bush, and that's really what it is, a bush that is big enough for the birds to take rest in or to sit on its branches. So if you just take that picture from something that is so small to something large enough that the birds of the air sit in it. All right, that's one. The next thing is the woman. And as I was making the bread, I just thought to myself, wow, what did the pioneer people do? What did the ancient people do to make their bread? I've got all kinds of modern conveniences that assisted me in making the bread. What did they do? But one thing that you need to know, as Amy Jill Levine explains it, that she's not just taking a packet of yeast out of the cabinet, right? That she's got leaven, maybe like sourdough starter, but she takes and she hides it. That's how the text in Greek actually reads. She hides it in the dough. But here's even more interesting. It says 3 measures, and I meant to bring a measuring cup of a cup. Well, do you know what 3 measures actually amounts to? 30 to 40 pounds of flour. Not just a cup. According to the recipe that I used to make bread, when it started to rise, I went, what am I going to do with all this bread? Fortunately, I had a freezer that I could put some in the freezer. Imagine, 30 to 40 pounds. Who is she making bread for? Imagine the oven. I can't imagine how she would have made this bread. So that's, wow. She hides the yeast in 30 to 40 pounds of flour. And we're not really told what happens, but you can kind of guess, right? Wow. And what about this merchant? It's like, you buy and sell and you have a job that you do, a business to run, and this merchant, and perhaps through time of wheeling and dealing as the merchant might, that, he goes, this is all wonderful stuff. They just had a story this morning on the morning news about the estate sale people. And they were in this woman's house, and her mother had died. And I had to chuckle a little bit because going through, as they were telling the story, because it was much better than putting all this stuff out on the front lawn for a yard sale, that the estate people come in. And they were going through her house, and they panned past a curio cabinet. And since Steve has worked in consignment stores, on the top shelf of the curio cabinet were about 15 Hummels. And I just had to laugh because he said his store wouldn't even take them anymore because nobody buys Hummels anymore. So imagine a merchant, shopping around, finding good things, finding bad things. But in his mind, the merchant has, if I just found one thing, I could retire and, move to Aruba. I don't know where they would move to in the Middle East. But move to someplace other than the desert, right? Wouldn't that be the great place to go? Not San Diego, because they have earthquakes and tidal waves there. But some place that has a moderate climate that you never have to worry about anything again, and you could just sit on your veranda, if you all know what a veranda is, sipping your mint juleps, whatever you want to do. I'm thinking of the Louisville folks on mint juleps. But in any event, he finds it. So what are we to make? What are these You see, a part of it is, remember that if they're about the reign of God, and here I'm trying to not go into explaining them, because remember, if we have to explain the parable, then we've kind of totally destroyed how the parable was intended to work, that it was to leave you guessing, leave you questioning, leave you wondering what this is about. And I love it. At the end, it's just like what happens, right? It's for the teachers here. I'm sure Carla and Rebecca, you get it, and any teachers here. Jesus goes, he asked his disciples, and I just love how this works, right? Did you understand what I've just said? And they're going, yes, yes. But you really know they're going, no, 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 no. They have no clue in the world what he just said. But in order to keep you happy, right, in order to make you smile, they're just going, yes, of course. And then they get together afterwards and they go, what the heck were they talking about? Does anybody understand what the teacher just said? I'm sure they did that, right? That's in the fine print in between the verses that you have to go to look in the gospel. So what, even to ask the question, what is it that they're supposed to understand? Well, let's just consider it again. Something that is small, producing something that is so big that birds come, hiding something in dough that's going to produce more bread. Why? What is that about? The merchant, now you have to work with this one a little bit more, that the merchant sells everything for this pearl that is found, and then what does he have? A pearl. What can you do with that? Does it give you food on your table? Does it provide shelter? Does it put clothes on your back? What do you want that for? Selling everything to have something valuable for which you're willing to give everything you have away? Something about, you have to ask these questions. Because you see, in asking the questions, it could mean that there isn't going to be one answer to the question. Because if I've never baked a loaf of bread in my life, how would I understand this? If I've never encountered, and I have to say, I thought of how this mustard plant must have grown, that I put a little tiny sprig of basil in my garden, and there is more basil than I could use in 10,000 years. And unless I'm going out every day and picking it and eating it raw off the plant, it's like, what am I going to do with this basil? There's only so there's something about abundance, more than we could imagine, that there's something about being willing to give everything. Now see, I'm making an interpretation in order to possess one valuable thing. Something about, this is just, there's absurdity in some of this. Absurdity and strangeness, and just, you have to kind of figure it out somehow or another. Otherwise, you just stop at the parable and there's no searching and trying to reach deeper into, you see, if this is about the reign of God, then something about these is intended to lead you into either an awareness of, an experience of, an encounter with the reign of God. So here's some questions that Amy Jill Levine leaves us with. Speaking to the merchant, will we know what we truly want when we see it? Will we be willing to go all in, not for a gamble, but for an ultimate concern? Are we willing to step aside from all we have to obtain what we want? Now just pause for a moment and think about it. Here we are, Chalice, at a point in our journey, in your long journey. Try applying those questions to us today. Will we know what kind of church we want to be when we see it? What are we willing to sacrifice, to give up, to let go of in order to obtain what we really want to be as a church. She comments, finally, she says, you have to wonder, this woman hides the leaven in 30 to 40 pounds of flour and then takes it down to the communal bakery, which they do even today in some countries. And she says, let's have a feast. Everyone in town is welcome to come and share this bread. Is that the reign of God in our midst?